Alright guys, welcome back to Token Tech. Today I want to do a video showing you how to overclock an nvidia graphics card. Now I have a 1070. Some of you might know that I used to have a Vega 64 and a RX 580, which I have currently sold. I sold like 3 different graphics cards, and currently I'm using a used GTX 1070, which I have put underwater. It is running really well. And I wanted to get more experience with water cooling and overclocking NVIDIA graphics cards. So this video is going to give you some tips and tricks, basically run down how to overclock an NVIDIA graphics card. If you just picked up a used 10 series card, if you have a 10 series card and want to overclock it, and this stuff will basically apply the same way to the new 20 series or RTX graphics cards just as well. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So the first thing, as you're going to see on my screen, is a tool called MSI Afterburner. Now for AMD graphics cards, as some of you might know, you can overclock right from the driver. It has it all built into the Radeon settings, and you can go ahead and overclock right from there. Control all of your P states, voltages, core clocks, memory clocks, fan speed, power limits, temperature limits, all that stuff straight from there. And it typically works pretty well, at least in my experience, with Vega 64 and 580 and a 480. Now, when it comes to NVIDIA, they don't have any built-in tool to do this. You have to get third-party tools like MSI Afterburner. Now, there are others from like EVGA and so on, but this seems to be the most popular one, so we're going to go with this one. Now, MSI Afterburner, you can get it from this website right over here. I'll post the link in the description of this video if you're having a hard time finding it. Right, you just go to this link. This is the current version as of April 22nd, 2019. So there might be newer versions, but all you do is scroll down to the bottom here. You'll see all of these, and you'll see all the different versions: 3.0, 4.0, all the way up to the newest current version, which is 4.6.1 stable final. You just click that, download it, go to your downloads folder, extract the file, right click extract, and then go ahead and run the installer, and it'll install it. Now it might not look like this, but we'll go through the settings in just 1 second. So here you're going to be able to monitor all these different things: temperature, voltage, memory clock, GPU clock, right? And these are going to be the important things to monitor. And you can also get a graph with much more specific information and a log, a time log down here, which you can scroll through here, or you can hit this button, detach, and you can pull it aside. You can grab the corner and make it much larger, and you can also control what comes up on here, and we'll do that in just a second. So you can see all the different core clock speeds and all that stuff. Yeah, now things are going to start ramping up because I am recording using the NVIDIA encoder, which means that it is using a little bit of the graphics card to actually record this video. That being said, let's get into it. So first thing we're going to want to do before we touch any of these settings is go into, well, the settings menu. Now here we want to check some things. Right here it's going to have start with Windows and start minimized. You're going to want to do that so that your overclock applies when your system boots up. If you don't do that, you're going to have to manually go into Afterburner and set your overclock every single time. If you have this to start up with Windows and to start minimized, you will have it straight out the gate. Okay. Another thing you want to do is go down here and unlock voltage control. That's not going to be checked. You want to check it. And unlock voltage monitoring. You want to check that as well. So you can see the voltage and you can change the voltage. This is going to be essential to overclocking. Now here's your fan. You can set stuff here. I don't need to worry about that because I have mine on a water block, so no fans are plugged into the graphics card. But you might want to look at these settings if you have fans connected or using an air-cooled card. And then you would actually adjust the fan speed, which mine, as you can see, is 0 over here on the right-hand side. Now back to the settings menu. This is our on-screen display. Now some of you might not know this, but a lot of reviewers and influencers will use MSI Afterburner with Rivatuner, I believe that's how it's pronounced, to get their numbers, get their graphs, and get their on-screen display to show you the frame rate, the memory usage, and so on. And this is where you do that. So all of these things will be checked for you. And what you want to do is just go through and uncheck anything you don't need. So for instance, I have a 8-core 16-thread CPU, the 1800X, and all of these CPUs right here, all the different cores and threads, and they will all be checked, and it'll make everything look really messy. I like to uncheck them and just get the overall CPU usage, right? Same thing for overall CPU temperature. I don't really need to know all the little things. Um, Voltage, limits, fan speed, all that stuff, fan tachometer. I just turn all that stuff off because I don't really need to know all of that. Again, don't have any fans connected. Power turned off, all these things turned off. Really, I just want GPU temp, GPU usage, memory usage, core clock, memory clock. Again, important information on the screen so you can see how things are going throughout your benchmark. GPU voltage, that's interesting. Probably not going to be that useful for an NVIDIA card, and I'll tell you why later, but yeah, we'll continue with that. CPU temperature, as we already said, CPU usage, as we already said, CPU clock speed, so we can see how the CPU is boosting or not boosting. RAM usage, we want to see how much RAM is using, whether you need 16 gigs or not. Usually you do these days. Frame rate. Now this one's a little different, so we'll talk about it in just a second, but you want to have your frame rate up there so you can see the frame rate. And then average, 1% and 0.1% low. These are just for when you're doing a benchmark run. Again, we'll get into that in a second. So these aren't going to be up all the time, but when you initiate a benchmark or a recording of a benchmark, it will then average all these numbers together from when you start and stop the benchmark. So these are pretty important as well for testing reasons. Now for frame rate, you might notice that it has in parentheses graph. And what that is, if you decide to use this and you want to see it, you might notice that some of the tech reviewers, and when I show you what mine looks like, you'll see it, have what's like a graph going across that shows you the frame rate or the frame time, the intervals, instead of just having a number. That's going to be a lot easier to read and to visualize. So all you have to do is click on frame rate like I have, go here, and instead of text, set it to graph. Now graph is only going to do so much for you. That'll give you like a line graph, like one of these over here on the right hand side in the benchmark on the on-screen display. If you hit these three dots over here and you scroll down all the way to the bottom, you can see here it says any item. You want to click on that, all right, double click it, drop down, you have graph, bar chart, or diagram. Diagram is the one that most people use because it is the easiest to visualize and understand what's going on. So we'll go ahead and hit apply there, hit OK, and now that's how our frame rate will be displayed. Again, it all makes sense when you finally see it. So we have all those things checked, and those are also the things that will come up on our monitoring down here. So you could have more things, you could have less things, whatever you care about you can set, and it'll come on down here, and you put on-screen display, right? So again, if I click on here, I can click to show on-screen display, or I can take that off. What that means, if it's not on, the GPU temperature won't be shown on screen, but because it has the check, it will come on down here. But if I click this box, show on screen, then it'll actually show it on screen while we're doing the benchmark. So on screen, you can have that toggled. I have it toggled with the number pad plus button. You can set it to any hotkey you want it to be. I do that because that way when I'm playing a game for fun, I don't have all these numbers on the left-hand side. I can turn that off. But when I'm doing a benchmark, I can turn that on. Now benchmarking right here, this is when we're going to record the values that we get from our benchmark. This is important for if you want to keep your own records, or if you're doing like a review, or you just want to compare, overclocks or what have you. You can also set these to hotkeys. I have number pad, I believe that is the asterisk or star key, and the numpad dash or minus button. That way I can turn it on and off pretty easily. If we keep going to the right here, screen capture, I don't really use. Video capture, I don't use. Profiles, I don't really use. User interface, this is where things are going to be. You can set it to the way you like it. So show tooltips. I usually like to turn these off because they can get very annoying and just get in the way. Now, if you're new, you might want to leave those on so you can get all the little tips, but I like to turn them off because they get in the way. You can set your language, temperature format. I think everyone at this point is basically going to use Celsius. Your time format, not really that big of a deal, but definitely if whatever you're more used to, so you can set that to 12 or 24, whatever you want. And then when you scroll down, right here is your skin, right? So that's going to be how the software appears, like this one. So as you can see, I'm using MSI Touch of Modern, right? But if you drop it down, you can have all of these different ones, right? And it gives you a little preview right down here of what it'll look like with these different skins. And you can pick whichever one you like. It's not going to affect the usability of it, but I like the modern skin. And just hit apply and press OK. And now you should be good to go in terms of overclocking and viewing the results both on screen and in this little drop down over here. So first things you want to do are offset your put your core voltage all the way to the right. Put your power limit all the way to the right. And that is linked with our temp limit. You can unlink this if you want to, and maybe that'll be a bigger difference if you're using an air-cooled card. So you can unlink it and you can move this around as much as you want without affecting anything else. But I just like to leave it linked for now. You can adjust your fan speed, 60%, auto, 100%, whatever you are comfortable with and whatever you can deal with in terms of noise. Now you might be wondering, why did I set these to 100%, basically just dropping them all the way to the right. Now this is 112%, but whatever. Well, unlike AMD cards, which are a little more tricky to overclock and you have to use a lot more knowledge and you have to mess with them and tinker with them to get the undervolt just right and get the overclock just right and get your memory clock just right and get everything just right to get the maximum performance, which people like me really enjoy, and that's a lot of fun for us. NVIDIA makes it very boring. Everything is basically locked down in the BIOS of the graphics card. So the core voltage, you can set it to 100%, plus 100%, but it's hard limited in the BIOS anyways. So this slider doesn't really do anything. So you can set it to 100%, you're not going to kill your card. It's hard set in the BIOS to max out at a safe voltage, which is obviously going to limit your overclock. Same thing with the power limit. With AMD, you can do a plus 50% to the power limit to get 150%. You can even mod the card, through a registry edit and get over 150% to really push those cards. With NVIDIA, you're limited to 112%. Now, different cards might have slightly different variants of how far they can go. I know that's true on the RTX cards, but regardless, they are all still very small differences. So it's not really that. Again, this is going to be limiting you, definitely. And you can see that in the charts. It'll tell you that it's hitting the power limit all the time, and if only it had a little bit more power. Now, maybe there are BIOS edits out there, perhaps, but those would be used at your own risk. But yeah, so you can feel pretty safe maxing out these 3 sliders at the top. They're not going to damage your card. You'll be just fine. Now to the nitty gritty. This is where you're really going to see performance changes. That's the core clock and the memory clock. So if you go ahead and click on the core clock, you can go ahead and type in whatever number you want, or you could use the slider, but I like to do typing it in. So I know for my card, because I've already tested it, 110 is basically about maximum for me. Some games I can get away with a bit more, but the lowest, or I should say the highest stable number is 110. Maybe I could push 115, but 110 seems to be pretty stable across the board. And I think that's fairly average. This card isn't the best overclocker, but it's not the worst. About 100 to 125 seems to be about average for these cards. Okay, so maybe start at 100 and slowly increase it by 5 or 10 megahertz until it's unstable. All right, now you want to do core clock and memory clock individually, because trying and changing both numbers at the same time, you won't know what's causing you to fail. So again, start with your core clock, start around 100, maybe 90, 100, and increase slightly, very small numbers of increase until it starts crashing or artifacting. And then you need to pull back a little bit and you'll be good. Now with memory clock, this is where these cards really shine. They can get massive improvements with memory clock. So for me, I found that I'm stable at about 400. Now I didn't do a lot of testing. I could probably push it a little bit higher than 400, but 400 seems to be about where I land. Now some of you out there might be thinking, wow, 400 isn't that high. I've seen people get basically 1,000 or a gigahertz or 700 or 800 or what have you. And I'll tell you, I actually was running it at 700 plus 750 for a long time. But one day I went into Overwatch, and for a little while it was fine. Then I randomly got a crash. Okay, rebooted the system, jumped into Overwatch again. 15-20 minutes later, driver, like the graphics driver, kept crashing. So I dropped it down to 600. Game lasted a little longer, kept crashing. Dropped down to 500. Game lasted even a bit longer, kept crashing. Dropped it down to 400, no crashes. So that's kind of a foreshadowing of what we're going to get into in just a second with how you should test these things. So for me, I know mine is stable at 400. I'm fine with that. I might be able to get 450, 425, 475, but I know 500 is unstable. So 400 is fine for me. Some of you might be able to get much more. Some of you might not be able to get 400, but the memory clock is usually where you can really fly with these graphics cards. Now, once you have these settings all dialed in, you'll hit the check mark here, and that'll apply these settings. So now we will have an overclocked graphics card. Now again, depending on your cooling, depending on your airflow, depending on what applications you're running and the power supply you have and so on, what you're comfortable with in terms of voltage and power draw, it's going to really affect the overclocking of this card. Now, these cards don't take that much power, so that shouldn't really be a worry. It's mostly about temperature, okay? Because the way that this works is this will apply a 110 overclock to the base clock, but then GPU boost will take over and push it that much further. So that's why things can get a little confusing for these cards, because GPU boost 3.0 does kind of auto overclock the card. And it'll continue to do that even after you overclock the card. So 110 and then GPU boost. Alright, so I think that's pretty good. So now what you need to do is test your system. So a very popular test. These are free. You can get them online. I guess I'll put the link for these also in the description. Is Heaven benchmark. Now this is DX11, so it's not super new or cutting edge, but it still will give us a baseline. Now this is by no means an extensive test. This is actually not the hardest test to run for a lot of graphics cards. Again, I can get away with much higher overclocks on Heaven than I can in actual games. But that being said, this is a good way to start. Now I'm going to play it at a very low resolution and in windowed mode. But what you should be doing is probably full screening it, which you do by checking this box and applying the highest resolution that you can do. So here you can go 16:9 all the way up to 1440p, right? But for this test, we're just going to keep it, a bit smaller so that it doesn't take up the whole window. But you want to make everything, basically max everything out, full screen it, the highest resolution that you can do. Because you're not trying to get a high score, you're trying to stress the card, okay? And then you would run it. And you would get something much like this. And you have all of those numbers on the display, so you can monitor it as it's running. And so you can see here we have our frame rate, which is in a graph. So you can see how you have spikes and dips, right? And you have your number here on the right, so you can see about 142 frames a second. And again, we're not going for score or high frame rates. We're going here to stress the card. And this isn't really going to stress the card. This is just an example. Okay, again, like I said earlier. So here you can see your RAM usage, which is about 4 gigabytes. CPU is at 38C, about 10% usage at 3.7 gigahertz. Memory, this is the GPU memory, just over a gigabyte, running at our overclock setting, which is 4400, and our GPU is at 48C. Now these numbers are going to continue to go up. Obviously it hasn't reached equilibrium yet. 70-80% usage at 2076 megahertz. Okay, so that's a pretty good overclock. And you can see the voltage. Again, this is going to be the lockout in the BIOS. It won't go any higher than this, basically. So you're kind of stuck here, regardless of what you do in your overclock. That's why I'm saying you don't have to worry so much about voltage and power limit when you're talking about an NVIDIA card. An AMD card, yeah, you want to pay attention to those things. But an NVIDIA, you can really just max them out and you're not going to worry about anything. Now, you're going to run this for a while. You want to run this for at least, I'd say 20 minutes, an hour is much better, just to make sure everything is stable, roughly speaking, and you can get your rough numbers with this. And what you can do is you can constantly or continue to edit your numbers, your overclock, while this is running. and you can see if it's going to crash or not because it's still running in the background. Now, once you dial in something that you're happy with, or you got a little artifacting, so you pulled it back a little bit, so you're feeling like it's your maximum stable overclock that you're happy with, and temperatures are okay, and all that other good stuff, what you're going to want to do is then end this one, right, and move on to something maybe a little more stressful. Now, that could be a whole number of different things. So in here, in Steam, I have 3D Mark. And you can go ahead and launch this and run different benchmarks and stress tests in 3D Mark. Now, this is what a lot of reviewers use to benchmark their systems in terms of scoring them to see how well they do, as well as stress testing. So up here, you can see we have benchmarks. We have all these different benchmarks. Now, this is going to be a bit more up to date. This is going to have DirectX 11, DirectX 12, 4K, 1080p, 1440p, all these different types of benchmarks, and like Firestrike and Time Spy Extreme, Firestrike Ultra, blah, 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 all these different things, as well as over here, stress tests. And you can go ahead and pick exactly what stress test you want. And you go ahead and run the stress test. It'll run 20 loops of that test and basically tell you if it was stable or unstable. And it doesn't mean that it crashes. So when it finishes one of these loops, it could end up with a 95% score or 90% score, and it'll tell you that is not stable, that you need to that it failed the test, right? It needs to be 98% or higher to pass the test. And to be honest, that might still be a little unstable. You really want 99% or higher to really feel confident in your overclock. But 98% is pretty good as well, and that's considered a pass. So that's what this is going to tell you. And now if you don't have this, don't worry about it. The best solution, honestly speaking, and the best that I've had in my personal experience is just to play games. Honestly, just to go out there and game. Go ahead and grab your favorite games, the games you play all the time, and play them for a long time, right? I'm telling you, go play your games for a long time with these overclock settings. You can keep this open if you want to go ahead and monitor it so you can see how your temperature and all the other stuff is doing. You can have your on-screen display while you're playing if you want to look at it live, or you can toggle that on and off. And you want to do that just so that you know that you, at least in the games that you play, your overclock is stable. Now that's how you're going to test it. That's the best way to test it. Just on a weekend, either by yourself or with some friends, just play hours and hours of your favorite games just to see if it's stable. Like for me, it was stable in all those benchmarks. It was stable in most of the games that I play. Jumped into Overwatch and it kept crashing. Turns out my graphics card memory clock was too high. I had to dial that back. But you might find yourself in a different place. Or if you don't play Overwatch, maybe you can run it a little higher. Anyways, that's how you should test it. That's how you overclock your GPU. It takes some time, a lot of messing around with it, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. These are pretty easy to overclock, and the performance in them is pretty good as well. Anyways, that's going to be it for me today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and come back for more videos on PC hardware coming up in the future. See you guys next time.